afternoon. Thank you for joining us tonight for the Countdown to Justice New York Child Victim Act panel discussion. I have the pleasure to introduce a friend, Alison Corning, a multidisciplinary artist and educator whose work focuses on social justice issues and the criminal justice system. At the convergence of traditional media and technology, her long career stepped in exhibitions, interactive and web design, as well as in aggregating communities of shared interest and fostering civil dialogue. She's also the project director of the Incorrigibles. Alison, please.
Thank you, Raul, and thank you everyone for being with us tonight. I wanted to give just brief context about Incorrigibles' involvement in this panel. Incorrigibles is an interdisciplinary documentary art project that investigates the past and present of youth justice for girls. The project began with research in New York at the New York State Training School for Girls, which is an institution for delinquent girls in Hudson, New York that was open from 1904 to 1975. What came out in conversations and oral history interviews with women who were at the institution when they were young was a legacy of abuse, including child sex abuse that took place at that institution. So when New York's Child Victims Act lookback window opened, we began to realize how few people knew about it. As well as looking for other women who were at the training school, we wanted to reach as broad a population as possible to spread the word before the window closes. Incorrigibles has an exhibition at the New York City Municipal Archives at the invitation of Doris. It was supposed to be up for 2 months, but it'll be over a year due to COVID. And we're so lucky to be able to work together to bring this panel to you. I want to thank Raul and LaTanya and Commissioner Toole at Doris, and of course, Michael Fitzgerald, our moderator, and incredible guests. And I have to give a special shout out to Sarah Baig, who is our communications maven. Sarah recently graduated from John Jay and has been the master force in bringing this event together. Thank you so much, Sarah. And to start us off with the song, I'd like to introduce Ella Wylde. Ella is a singer, songwriter, and gifted musician raised in Brooklyn. She was just 7 years old when she started writing songs. Ella wrote Incorrigibles' theme song about her namesake, Ella Fitzgerald's time at the New York State Training School. And now, she'll sing a song related to tonight's topic. Take it away, Ella.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ella, and I just wanted to give a little bit of background on the song that I'm going to be singing, if that's all right. It's called Favorite Doll, and it was actually written by my producer. Her name is Drew, and she sent it to me after we'd had a conversation a few days after we'd first met, and we found out that we actually had a lot more in common than we initially assumed. She sent me this song and asked if I had any interest in singing it, and I listened to it, and of course I did. And so I'm gonna sing it for you tonight. I'm honored to be here tonight singing this song. It's pretty much stayed the same since she sent it to me 3 years ago. There's a couple lyric changes, nothing crazy. I did end up changing a little bit of the melody and the tempo just to fit me, but this is Favorite Doll. My favorite doll is in a well. How she got there, I can't tell. I promise not to tell. For if I tell, I'll go to hell. Can someone break this spell? 100 days ago, my father died. And I was horrified, I wondered why. And then a light flashed deep inside, revealing pain that I denied. 100 days ago, an angel cried, a part of wound that I tried to hide. I closed my eyes. The heavens cried. Your little doll would like to come outside. My favorite doll is in a ditch, but I don't care, 'cause I'm a bitch. No one knows I'm not a snitch. How else could I make sense of this? There's no way to make sense of this. Now I'm the girl who always wins the prize. So bright, just right, so civilized, so good at everything that she tries, and best of all, she never cries. My favorite doll is not a doll at all. I am the doll, I am 4 feet tall, and I can't recall why I'm so small, but all in all, I am appalled. My favorite doll is in a hole that holds the soul he stole. He was consoled, I was controlled. That's when I knew the world was cold. That's why I have to play a role. But if I reach back and get that girl and save her, then, well, maybe she'll save the world. But if I fall, we'll both be lost. So why take a chance at such a cost? My favorite doll is in a well. How she got there, I can't tell. I promised not to tell. He told me not to tell. For if I tell, I'll go to hell. Can someone break this spell? Can someone break this spell? My favorite doll. My favorite doll. My favorite doll. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Ella, for sharing your voice, your talent, and your sensitivity with us tonight. Thank you. Now I would like to pass the mic to Pauline Toole, the Commissioner of the New York City Department of Records and Information Services.
Good evening, everyone. And I would like initially to thank Allison for her continued collaboration, the Assemblymember for her leadership, and the activists who are participating and getting justice for people who've been victims of child sexual violence. Thank you. It's my privilege tonight to introduce Michael Fitzgerald, who is based in New York and is a senior reporter for the Imprint, which is an independent daily news outlet that focuses on the nation's child welfare and youth justice systems. He previously was an editor for Pacific Standard magazine and has reported for the New Republic, Vice, and Outside, among other outlets. Michael has won a number of awards as both a writer and an editor, and was a Neiman Journalism Fellow in 2010. In 2018, for the Imprint, Michael launched that nonprofit news outlet's New York Bureau and has led its statewide coverage of issues related to foster care, adoption, youth justice, and related topics. He often reports on the experiences of New York families involved in those systems, which can include childhood sexual abuse, trauma, and recovery. The Imprint has been recognized for its coverage as one of the only outlets focused exclusively on these issues, and is widely cited in policy debates and by other national and local New York media outlets. So without further ado, our moderator for the evening, Michael Fitzgerald. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Toole, and thank you, Ella, for the beautiful song. Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Fitzgerald. Thank you for joining us tonight for this important and timely conversation about the Child Victims Act and an upcoming deadline in the law for victims to pursue claims against their abusers in court. This law has opened up a broad conversation about how victims can seek justice after these crimes are committed, and I am honored to be here with our panel tonight to discuss those issues. So the plan tonight is we will hear from each panelist. Each of our 5 panelists will take a few minutes to share their stories as people who have either fought for this reform or fight for or care for victims in other venues. After we hear from each panelist individually, bring everyone together for a group conversation on what we've learned since the law was passed and what might come next on this issue. And if at any point you have questions, please feel free to add them in the chat. And it's just a small clarification. I was not a Neiman fellow, as the commissioner said. There's another journalist named Michael Fitzgerald who did have that honor. We're frequently confused for each other, but I don't want to take credit for his accomplishment. So just a small clarification on that, sorry. Okay, so moving on. What is the Child Victims Act? I'm just going to give a quick primer before we get to our first panelist. Until January 2019, New York State had one of the shortest statute of limitations for victims to bring childhood sexual abuse cases in civil or criminal courts. Most survivors only had until age 23, but the Child Victims Act, passed in 2019, extends the statute of limitations for adult survivors, recognizing that many may not disclose their experiences until their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, their 60s, or later. And under the law, anyone who is under the age of 23 on February 2019 will now have until their 55th birthday to file a civil lawsuit against their abuser, or up to their 28th birthday to file criminal felony charges. The CVA also creates a temporary window, look-back window, which is really what we're here to talk about tonight. And that began on August 14th, 2019. At that point, any adult survivor of childhood sexual abuse could file a civil lawsuit against their abuser or a negligent institution that harbored them, no matter how long ago the abuse took place. That 1-year look back was extended due to the pandemic last August. And that window, we are now rapidly approaching the closing of that window, which is early next month, August 13th, just 3 weeks from tomorrow, 21 days. And after that point, after August 13th, the new extended statute of limitations will remain in place, but the look back window for claims that could be decades older will then be closed. The law passed, the Child Victims Act passed after more than a decade of vigorous advocacy, and the courts have been flooded with more than 6,400 cases since then, according to the most recent numbers I've seen. Be interested to hear from our panelists if they have more updated numbers. And they're likely spiking now as we approach that August 13th deadline. So before I introduce our first guest, last thing, I just want to recognize that these can be really difficult issues to discuss. So I want to salute our panelists for their bravery in speaking publicly about them. Some of our panelists in the past have chosen to share their experiences as childhood victims of abuse and use that personal experience in a public way to protect other victims and prevent future crimes. So while these stories may be hard to hear, they can be even harder to share in a public setting, but we are here to keep a spotlight on this issue, to talk about them, take things out of the shadows where we can reckon with them. That's part of my role as an independent journalist, and I'm grateful to our panelists for participating. So with that, I am so pleased to introduce our first guest, Assemblymember Rodneyse Bichotte Ermelin. She represents New York State's 42nd Assembly District for Flatbush, East Flatbush, Midwood, and Ditmas Park in Brooklyn. She is the first Haitian American woman elected in New York City, and she powerfully shared her own experience as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse on the floor of the Assembly before the Child Victims Act was passed. So with that, Assemblymember, please begin as soon as you're ready.
Yes, can you hear me? Thank you so much, Michael, for the great introduction. Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. As you heard, my name is Assemblymember Rodneyse Bichotte. I represent Flatbush, Brooklyn. And before we begin, I certainly want to thank the New York City Department of Records and Information Services, WomensActivism.NYC and Incorrigibles. I would also like to acknowledge Commissioner Toole, Allison, our moderator, Michael Fitzgerald, our panelists, Joelle, Natasha, Justin, Jeff, and beautiful performer, Ella Wylde. I would like to take this moment to share with you my experience. At the age of 10, I was hit by a speeding car while crossing the street that left me bedridden with permanent foot damages. And many people know in my neighborhood, I wanted to be a dancer and a gymnast, but I was stuck home. I was stuck home and I was homeschooled. And there was a prayer group who would come to my house and pray for my mom, for my recovery. During my recovery, when I started to walk, I was then approached by one of the pastors who were in the prayer group and who actually was the predator who sexually assaulted me. It was an ongoing experience. I was sexually abused over and over again. At the age of 10, I didn't understand it, but I know it didn't feel good. And being raised in a immigrant household and as a Haitian American young girl, there wasn't anyone for me to confide in because it was prohibited. I didn't want to be blamed for being sexually assaulted by a pastor, a person of authority. So it was a secret that stayed with me for a very, very long time. I finally decided to come out when I became a legislator in 2016, when the CVA, the Child Victims Act, was reintroduced. I came up and I spoke up and I told everyone I was sexually abused as a child, and it was the first time. And it was very important for me because I was not aware there was advocacy and there was resources for someone like me who had to deal with a trauma for over 30 years. So when I finally did tell my story on the floor, I was heavily active. And then when we finally introduced it, I stood up. And when I said my story once again, there were two other legislators on the floor who also said their stories. We had Catalina Cruz, we had Yulene New, and then while we were telling our stories on the other side in the House, we had Senator Bichotte, who also tell her story. So it just says that a lot of us share a lot of commonalities, share a lot of struggles and secrets, and taking the first step forward to actually tell the world that we too were abused was very encouraging for many people. So I will continue to advocate the Child Victims Act. I know we're going to go into more discussion in terms of how we want to reform the current Child Victims Act, but I'm certainly happy to be here and to always continue to be an advocate. And I thank all of you for being that resource, for being that fighter for all these people who were abused. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Assemblymember, so much. That is a powerful story. It's difficult to hear. I can only imagine what it was like to live through that. So thank you. And I know you've said it before in a public setting, but I'm sure it doesn't get easier. So we appreciate your strength in being able to share that. And you brought up many important themes I hope we'll get to later in the conversation. So with that, next up, we have Joelle Casteix. She has been traveling the country and the world as a speaker and author and advocate for survivors of childhood sexual abuse, which has included advocacy for laws, including California and New York's own Child Victims Act, as well as in other states. She is also the author of The Well-Armored Child, A Parent's Guide to Preventing Childhood Sexual Abuse, and a founding board member of the Zero Abuse Project, which is a nonprofit dedicated to the eradication of childhood sexual abuse. So with that, Joelle, please take it away.
Well, thank you so much. And again, I would like to thank all my fellow panelists, and I'm very honored to be here. And I want to thank the Incorrigibles for taking the time to invite me. My name is Joelle Casteix, and I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse. I was sexually abused at my high school in Southern California. And it was the choir director who I looked up to and admired because I was being prepped to go on to an opera conservatory. And because he had that kind of power over me, he was able to keep me quiet even after he got me pregnant and gave me sexually transmitted disease. But what also really destroyed me through all this was the fact that I had told the school, I had informed administrators that something was going on. And they told me that it was just love and that I needed to stay quiet. And so I dealt with a lot of pain and a lot of trauma for the next 10 to 15 years. And it was very difficult because in the Catholic tradition where I grew up and at the Catholic school, I was openly blamed for the abuse. And that's just, it's horrible for a kid to go through. And so when I hit my late 20s, early 30s, I made some conscious decisions because I was going down a road where I was either going to live or I was going to die. And I decided that I was not going to let this abuse and cover up get the best of me. And in 2003, California opened its first one-year civil window for survivors of child sexual abuse. And I didn't think I had a case. I was still blaming myself for the abuse. But I spoke to an attorney who told me, no, the abuse wasn't my fault. And that what happened to me was a crime. And that I could come forward and not only protect little Joelle, but also protect the community where he lived right then, because he was still teaching, he was still interacting with kids. And there were still people who covered up the abuse who needed to be exposed. And I didn't have to use my name if I didn't want to. I could have been a Jane Doe. But I decided that it was time for me to own my story. And so I came forward and I filed a lawsuit and I was very public about it. And I evolved into a spokesperson for other survivors who didn't have the ability or the voice to speak out. And I was able to expose that the man who sexually abused me abused other girls. And I was able to expose that school administrators did know about it at the time. And they covered it up. And so that was very powerful. I was able to warn the community where he was living and fight to ensure that he wouldn't be with other kids. And I watched as myself and 90 some odd other people in Orange County, California, where I filed my case, got this tremendous amount of healing and decided to incorporate this into my career. And so I fought for these bills, these Child Victims Acts in states all over the country and helped survivors come forward, because no one should have to suffer through what I did and no one should have to feel that they're alone. And the deadline for New York is coming up and I cannot emphasize enough how important it is. You can maintain your privacy. You don't if you're not ready to talk to your family, it's okay. But talk to an attorney, get help, and do what you can to get your power back and make sure that what happened to you gets exposed and people are held accountable.
Thank you, Joelle. And again, such a powerful story. Also difficult to hear, but and I know you've also shared it publicly many times before. But we again appreciate you sharing it in this setting, and I look forward to revisiting some of those themes later in the conversation. So next up, we have Justin Cabrera. He is an emergency department social worker with experience in inpatient, outpatient, and emergency department settings across several major hospital systems in New York City. He's also licensed for clinical social work in 3 states, New York, New Jersey, and Arizona. So with that, Justin, feel free to begin whenever you're ready.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I'm Justin Cabrera, and I currently work in a few different capacities in the social services sector. I'm an emergency medicine social worker at a major university teaching hospital in Brooklyn, New York. I'm a youth and family counselor at a community-based organization up in the Bronx, and an adjunct lecturer and field instruction supervisor at a couple of the schools of social work here in New York City. I'm also finishing up my doctorate in social welfare at the Graduate Center, CUNY, and the Hunter Silberman School of Social Work, where I'm studying the barriers towards intimate partner violence screening in emergency departments. I have a unique interest in working with survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual assault, many of whom have experience with childhood sexual abuse, and help guide them into turning their past and current trauma into resilience. Through my work in the emergency department, I have had the privilege of bearing witness to the stories that survivors entrust to me. And I'm humbled to have the opportunity to sit on this panel to share the knowledge that I have learned from them to help spread the word that hope out there, hope is still out there, and that survivors' voices no longer need to be silenced. So thank you for this opportunity.
Great, thank you so much, Justin. Next up, we have Jeff Anderson. He is a nationally known trial lawyer, the founder of Jeff Anderson and Associates, and he's known as a pioneer of sexual abuse litigation, advocating for those abused by clergy and other trusted professionals. So whenever you're ready, Jeff, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It is a privilege to share this evening with all the survivors and panelists here today, and even a greater privilege every day to have the opportunity to work with courageous survivors who come forward, share their secret, and are in New York and some other states that have open statutes to take action. And it is such a privilege every day to know that they and their courage and the law that allows them to take legal action and bring a civil suit to identify their offender and or any institution that chose to protect that offender, and thus hold the wrongdoers accountable, but at the same time, take their power back. Because these kids that are abused by authority figures particularly, it's really not about sex, it's about power and the abuse of it. And when a survivor, as the Assemblywoman or as Joelle just accounted, has an opportunity to stand up and give voice to their truth and be believed, and then take some action, and in the case of New York, bring a civil action against the wrongdoers, they are really recovering power that was robbed from them as children or vulnerable adults. And so in New York now, as Michael said, there have been over 6,400 civil suits brought because of the opening of the window. We posted a database today pertaining to the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy and its employees that identified that over 3,300 suits have been brought in New York against them alone and their employees, and identified over 1,700 offenders related to those institutions. Over 1,700 offenders in New York through May 31st. And there's more to come. And there were dozens of those offenders that have never before been exposed or revealed as offenders. And what survivors have done by having come forward, and what survivors in New York need to know, that when you do file a suit, as Joelle said, you can be a John Doe or a Jane Doe and remain anonymous, but you identify that offender, many times for the first time in the community. What happens then? You have taken your power back. You have confronted the offender that violated you years or decades ago. You have exposed the offender, perhaps for the first time, thus given other survivors the chance to come forward and say, oh, that was done to me and I've suffered in silence and secrecy and shame for years or decades. And I'm going to come forward. and tell my truth and get help and bring suit, perhaps. You've also, and every survivor that has come forward in New York and brought suit has also done something that is the most powerful and perhaps sacred thing that any other human can do. And that is save another child from the horror inflicted upon the plaintiff, the survivor. And that's real. Because every survivor that shares his or her secret, takes legal action under the Child Victims Act, identifies the offender and or the institution that made the conscious choice to allow that to happen, gets exposed and children get saved and protected. This is a child protection movement, and the opening of the statute of limitations until August 13th is one of the most important public policy developments across this country in child protection. The time is now. Survivors must act. They can come forward, and it is every attorney's opportunity to not only protect those survivors that do come forward on whose behalf we speak and act from further harm, but also give them the chance to take their power back. They are. And that they can do something to protect others and take some of their power back. And so it's a privilege to be here tonight. And it's a privilege to have a chance to help survivors under the Child Victims Act in New York. And the good news is so many have come forward. The bad news is that there's a short window of time in which survivors can exert their power and have that voice and bring that legal action until August 13th.
Thank you, Jeff. And I see questions rolling in, and I would just want to encourage everyone again, we've already heard such impactful remarks. I'm sure there must be questions out there. Don't be shy. Feel free to put them in the chat and we will get to them later if you have any questions for our panelists or the whole group. Okay, so next up and our final speaker is Natasha R. Johnson. She is an attorney, academic, artist, activist, entrepreneur, and yoga teacher with nearly 20 years of global experience in anti-violence and in the gender justice space. She is now the executive director of the North Brooklyn Coalition Against Family Violence, which provides trauma-informed legal policy advocacy and activism on domestic violence, anti-human trafficking, sexual assault, and female genital mutilation and cutting, with an emphasis on creating culturally specific interventions for Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. So Natasha, whenever you're ready to begin, thank you.
Hi, thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for the invitation to be here to speak about such an important topic. Unlike other folks on the panel, I'm not speaking from a survivor perspective, but I am speaking from a zealous advocate perspective, really looking at, you know, the ways in which the issues of childhood sexual abuse really sort of impact and make one much more susceptible and potentially much more vulnerable to other forms of gender-based violence. And that's really, I think, the way that my invitation and what I could be a contribution to these conversations is really valid here. You know, the work that we do at North Brooklyn Coalition is really around providing legal services for folks who have become survivors of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, including elder abuse, same-sex abuse, and other forms of sexual assault, including child marriage, female genital mutilation and cutting, and human trafficking. And so issues like childhood sexual violence oftentimes, as much research shows, make individuals as adults much more susceptible to these kinds of relationships, also much more questionable sort of boundaries, much more fluid boundaries with respect to relationships. And so I think that that's really what my role here this evening is, really to sort of talk about what some of those overlaps might be, what some of those precautions might be, but also as an attorney who has been an advocate around other similar principles, including female genital mutilation and cutting and its impact in the gender-based violence space, and what it means to be a zealous advocate in those spaces around developing policy. I'm also here, I think, to provide a few nuances and maybe provide a little bit more advocacy for the potential petitioners around how to best take care of themselves if they're thinking about moving forward with a case like this, because as mentioned, it is an opportunity. I think it was Jeff who mentioned it's an opportunity opportunity to really sort of reclaim justice for yourself. But also it's super important to think about what the impact of a case like this can be on an individual and on a potential litigant, even if they aren't a named plaintiff. And so I think those are some of the contributions that I'd love to offer to tonight's conversation. So I'm looking forward to what we jump into.
Great, thank you so much, Natasha, and thank you to all of our panelists for those introductions. We are now going to move into the roundtable discussion. I've got a couple questions for the group, but also great time for the audience to start putting your questions in the chat as well. I thought we'd start, you know, I would love to hear from the group, but maybe especially our first two speakers, the Assemblymember and Joelle, talking about, assuming everyone agrees with this, I'd be interested to hear if you don't, but you know, what are some reasons a victim should come forward? And what are the biggest challenges that come with that? And maybe either Joelle or Assemblymember Bichotte, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Well, for one, people should come forward if they can. I know it's very difficult because it's, I wouldn't say it's comforting, but it tells everyone that they're not alone in the struggle, in this secret society world, and that there's resources out there. When I came out on the assembly floor, none of my colleagues would have came out, and I stood up and I spoke, and then one by one, people stood up and said, I too was abused. I too was abused. And the power of coming out and speaking out is tremendous because it allows us to open opportunities now to litigate in the courts for people to find justice. I had a good friend who well, she's still around, who was abused maybe 50 years ago by a public school in New York City. And I didn't know she was abused. Her family didn't know she was abused. When she saw my statement, she decided to come out. She told her family for the very first time. Her kids are well in their 20s and 30s, and they all cried with her. They never knew mom went through this before. And now she had an avenue to seek justice and file a lawsuit against the city. So it's very important. And it could be very difficult, again, for people who are in situations, in immigrant communities where, you know, for example, like for me, you know, women tend to be silent when they are calling for help. They're normally blamed for actions that are used against them. And so it could be really difficult depending on your upbringing, your culture, the population that you're dealing with. Thank you.
And Joelle, if you have anything to add to that, I'm also wondering, how can friends and relatives, what can they do, in your opinion, that can be supportive, or what can they do? What are some tips you would give to friends and relatives who might want to try to help someone who is thinking about coming forward?
Well, first I want to touch on the first question, which is, you know, why should survivors come forward? And, you know, I like to tell people, I don't like this fact, but I like to employ, you know, predators never retire. They don't suddenly hang up, you know, their predatory behaviors and stop preying on kids. And so the more that we can put predators on alert that these behaviors will not be tolerated, the safer everyone is. And when you come forward and you use the civil justice system, you really are you're changing that balance of power. I was able to get my dignity back. I was able to own my story. And I was able to stand up and be backed by a court and say, hey, what happened to me was wrong. It was a crime and it wasn't my fault. And, you know, and I've worked with all kinds of communities who've had to deal with specific cultural issues, whether it's Guam or Alaska or border communities in the United States. And everyone faces the same challenges. And it's so important that, especially when you feel healed enough to come forward, to realize that you're not alone and help is available. And then on to the second question, what can family members and friends do? First, we all need to understand and embrace that a survivor is probably going to disclose at the worst possible moment. And that's when they are triggered or when they feel like they have to tell. And that'll be at a holiday or a funeral or a wedding. And so the best thing you can do is grant grace to that person. Say, I'm so sorry. I believe you. It wasn't your fault. And I have a great free ebook on my website. It's in the chat that you can download, and it has a bunch of great resources as well. But the things that you can say, most important is, I believe you, and it wasn't your fault. And those are the really important things. And just let them know you're not alone. You're not alone, and I am here for you.
Great, thank you. And I want to bring Justin into this conversation as a first responder, as a healthcare provider. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about our work in that healthcare context. What kind of resources do come to mind for you as like the first stop for someone when they do disclose to you that they have been abused? Like, what is your first response to that? And then where do you point them?
Yes, I mean, echoing off of what the previous two panelists shared, I think that it's very, very important to ensure that we are letting the survivors know that, we believe them, that we are there for them now that they are sharing their story, so that they know that they can trust us in the continued work that we do. There are, fortunately, in New York City, there's lots of resources available through the mayor's office to end gender-based violence, and also different community-based organizations where survivors can get, free counseling services. And also there's a domestic violence hotline through Safe Horizon that can also provide different types of services where survivors can just call in and receive assistance through that avenue as well. Every borough also has a family justice center through the court system, where it's like a one-stop shop where essentially any survivor can walk in and get basically any type of service that they need, whether that be counseling services, whether that be legal support or housing assistance, anything associated with their abuse, they can get that assistance through that avenue. And they can also help to refer them out for ongoing counseling as well. So luckily where we are in New York City, there's a ton of resources for survivors to act.
Thank you, Justin. So zooming out a little bit, let's talk about the Child Victims Act writ large. And I'd love to hear from really any of the panelists on this question. Let's start with where has it been a success? What has been the greatest benefit in your views in terms of the benefits to survivors before we talk about what other further reforms might be needed? And whoever wants to jump in first, I'd honestly be interested to hear any of your thoughts on this one.
Well, this is Jeff Anderson. I'd love to take that one because we've worked with now hundreds of survivors in New York alone, and where we have seen tremendous success is each survivor that has broken the silence and taken some action, we've seen transformation. Each survivor that has made that decision and shared that secret and taken some action has begun a process of recovery of power, and also have been empowered and emboldened to do something that they have never been able to do before, is not just tell what was done to them, but do something to protect other kids. So when we think of all the suits that have been brought and will be until the window closes, how many kids will be protected alone by that disclosure and those suits? It's staggering. Not as staggering as how many offenders remain out there, but staggering the number of kids that have been protected by the courage and bravery of so many survivors, who each had to do the difficult decision of taking action, which was really hard, but also can take ownership of the fact they did something about it and protect some other kids in the future. A powerful opportunity. and a very difficult thing to do. Requires bravery and requires support, as Justin said, which means getting help and working it in a way that you never have before or were able to before you stood up for yourself and other kids.
Anybody else want to follow that? Okay, well, Jeff, a follow-up question to you on that. I was wondering, as someone who has litigated so many of these cases, what does it require of someone who is coming forward? I mean, as you mentioned, it can be very difficult to go through one of these cases. Can you talk about just briefly some of the nuts and bolts of what you actually have to do in terms of the evidence collecting? We had one question from the audience about what happens if you're unable to pull a police report, for example. Can you just talk about the actual process just briefly?
Yeah, I think that's a great opportunity to talk about the process of coming forward and what does it really require. First, it requires a survivor to make the disclosure of the memory that they have and have that evaluated. And once that memory is evaluated, and most survivors underreported and underdisclosed initially anyway. But once they have made that disclosure, then it requires them to simply look at the choices that they're given under the law. And it's our job to help give them those choices. And then it is really an opportunity for them to reframe the experience. And many survivors, if not most, fear not being believed. And that's what kept them silent. And so the question always is, well, it's just me against him. I was just 10 years old and I didn't tell because nobody would believe me then and nobody's going to believe me now. And he is a powerful cleric, he's a powerful politician, he's a powerful coach, and he's a powerful teacher. And he was then and he still is. Who's going to believe me? And what we say to those survivors is, your truth counts. And we can prove your case on the strength of your account. And if you come forward and we bring this suit, we can then excavate more evidence and find other survivors, perhaps, that even support that claim. But you standing alone, telling that truth in itself is enough to make this case, and we can prove it. And we not only believe you, we can prove it. And the evidence that we gather in these cases comes from many forms, but more often than not, it comes from other survivors abused by the same offender or in the same institution that applied the same practices of secrecy and the like. And so that's how it works. And the evidence is there, and it comes from the truth and the lips of the survivor and his or her courage in having the ability and the legal ability to share it publicly.
Thank you. Natasha, you kind of explained how you are working downstream often with people who may have experienced abuse as children that maybe made them vulnerable to an abusive relationship as a grown-up or other forms of abuse later in their life. So from where you're sitting, what do you think somebody needs beyond what the Child Victims Act provides, right? Like could be, civil damages or financial reward, or if it's an institution, policy reforms potentially from one of those cases. But what else do you see as victims needing as part of their healing or moving forward with their lives?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I think everyone has echoed the first piece, which is that survivors need to be believed, right? Which I think is the primary barrier to most folks moving forward, not only with child victim sexual abuse cases, but all forms of gender-based violence violations. But I think in addition to that, when you think about what folks need to get made whole, that's such an individual remedy, right? And it's a remedy that theoretically can't be provided by the courts. Right, because it's really about being able to meet individuals where they are in real time and really trying to help people sort of walk back. In this instance, if we're looking at the Child Victims Act, the look back window, right? A 55-year-old up into a 55-year-old trying to look back to arguably when they were 5 years old. So trying to have someone sort of put the pieces of their life together and really understand all of the decisions that they might have made from 5 until 55, for example, right, through that lens now as a survivor of whatever this harm and this violation was. And so that really means acquiring a team. And some of those teams can come from maybe some of the folks that I think Justin mentioned, right? If we're looking just at New York specifically, right? There's a host of people there, but we know that, you know, New York can sometimes be unique in that way, and that those resources aren't available across the board. But I think what those don't speak to are also the family fractures that are present oftentimes, and the community fractures that are present as well, that oftentimes I think serve as a barrier sometimes for people moving forward in these kinds of cases. And so there's those sort of cultural and community-based and family-based sort of reparations that I think people also need support in thinking about how they repair as they continue to move forward with these cases as well, which is another piece that I think oftentimes gets stepped over or forgotten, or is only sort of recalled ancillary to moving forward with these kinds of cases. You know, I think some of the other things, and I know Michael, you and I had talked about some of this in preparation for this conversation. You know, I think the other piece, while I think legislation like this is so important, I think it also just sort of by the sheer nature of it strikes against the core of human behavior, right? The idea that there's a statute of limitations or a lack thereof, or flexibility within a statute of limitations tied to these really horrible, triggering and damaging memories, and sort of the idea that we even need to have one from a policy perspective in order for someone to be able to sort of move forward and effectuate justice for themselves, I think just sometimes strikes at the chord and creates a tension in just what it means to, you know, experience this. And I think Justin can probably speak to that more specifically as a clinician, but really thinking about what it means for someone to have to dredge up these kinds of memories in order to sort of satisfy a clock or a flexible clock. And so for me, when I think about what it means to sort of do policy advocacy and some of the other spaces in which I've done it in around female genital mutilation and cutting, and around domestic violence, and around asylum, you know, I often think about this piece as well, right? Because these are some of the legislative considerations that also get made. And so also very much inform how statutes get lived into. So that's the other piece that I also just wanted to sort of flag in this conversation, and just thinking about what sort of big legislative push or conversations happening on the other end that also then strikes just sort of against what it means for individuals and just sort of natural human behavior, and thinking about what it means for them to actually move forward and to try to effectuate justice for themselves in these kinds of instances.
Thank you. And I have some questions about legislation we'll get to in just a second. I have one more question about kind of the more personal healing process. Natasha or Justin, I'd be interested to hear from you on this as well. But you know, how does one approach all the fallout within families of revealing these incidences, especially if the perpetrator is in the family and it was decades ago? I mean, you know, how do you start to think about that? Especially, I mean, with this Child Victims Act, so many of the cases are aimed at institutions. So how do you start that process when the abuse is within the family?
So in my experience with survivors, mostly in adulthood, and speaking to them about the experiences that they're now kind of coming to terms with, in so many cases, we found that when they were children, they did try to come forward to tell their stories to a trusting adult or to a teacher or to someone in authority. And in a lot of instances, they were, you know, told to be silenced, more often because they wanted to protect the reputation of whoever it was that was, you know, the abuser. But what that says is to the child is that, well, okay, I understand that this may have happened to you, but that's not more important than, you know, protecting the abuser. And it kind of has an effect on the person throughout their lifetime. And I think a lot of the work that's done with the adult survivor of childhood sexual trauma is to try to unpack that and to, like, you know, really talk about that trauma and to let them be okay with the feelings that are come up, and also to help them to communicate that with the people that not only with the abusers that have hurt them, but with those that silence them from continuing to tell their stories. So a lot of times the work that I've done in a lesser so capacity, because in the emergency department, everything is kind of crisis and trying to deal with things on a very acute level. But sometimes, we have brought in family members into our shared space for the moment to help to facilitate those conversations, not to have them for them, but to encourage and empower the survivor to be able to tell their story again. And a lot of times, many family members, it may be 20, 30 years, since the first disclosure was made, they think in a very different way, and they are able to give that closure to survivors at times, to say at that time I was not thinking the way that I should have. I recognize now that that was a mistake, that I should have taken you for counseling. I should have believed you, and that really can help to start the process of healing within families as well.
Thank you. Did anyone, I have a next question ready, but did anyone else have anything they wanted to say on that point?
The other piece that Justin is speaking to is that, in these instances, particularly to my point around family and community fractures, is that there's also just an immense amount of guilt and shame for everyone involved around what signs or messages or communications they knew or didn't know or misunderstood or missed. And oftentimes it's at least in the work that I've done and working with colleagues, is that it's also about being able to create opportunities, as Justin was mentioning, for individuals to be able to have these powerful conversations in safe environments, and environments that at least they can try to identify as being safe, so that they can get to some of that healing. Oftentimes, I think this is life's work for that survivor, and oftentimes for the individuals who are participatory in assisting them in that process, if they're family members or community members, and so that's one of the pieces that I like to sort of share in thinking about what it means to be a zealous advocate for folks who move forward in these kinds of cases, that this is oftentimes, your life's work at this point. This is part and parcel of who you've become, and sort of a new identity that's going to be necessary for you to really step into much more powerfully if you want to think about what it means to navigate these processes. I also encourage folks to think about what the outcomes are, what the remedies are on the other side of this. Sometimes, it's really about reframing for yourself what it is that will make you whole, right? And that may not always be that you have the opportunity to sort of point the finger, proverbially or actually, at that wrongdoer, right? Particularly in some of these cases, that wrongdoer may have already passed away. If you're a 55-year-old litigant, right? Just looking at the facts and the realities of some of these things, some of those individuals are actually no longer with us. So you may not even get the opportunity to do that in that way. So I think that's another piece that's also important in thinking about what it means to sort of be able to be a zealous advocate on behalf of survivors who are thinking about navigating these kinds of cases, because I think that's can sometimes help inform and impact just really responsibly what it means for them to be able to be a stand for themselves as they move forward in these processes.
Thank you. So speaking of advocacy, just zooming out a little bit, before we talk about the future of advocacy around this issue in New York, Joelle, could you maybe speak about what you think the next phase is nationally around these issues? You've now seen this play out in a couple states. So what's next for this issue area, as far as what do you see happening in other states? Are there other versions of this kind of law coming up, or what's the future?
Yeah, well, first I want to touch on something Natasha said, and it has to do with whether or not the abuser is dead or alive. And it is possible to file a civil lawsuit against the institution, even if the abuser is still dead, is dead. Because what I like to tell people is that a child predator may have 10 victims, but an institution may have 10 predators. And so before someone sits back and says, well, gosh, this person's dead, always, seek counsel and advice. And then on to your second question, New York has given us, the civil window has opened another window for us that we haven't seen in any other state. And that's the availability of data. New York has a fabulous law where all civil lawsuits that are filed are put on the internet and are instantly accessible without cost. And we don't have that in California. I don't think we have that in any other state. And so we're going to be able to take this amazing data, and Jeff has alluded to it, and be able to go to other states that perhaps have very, very archaic statutes of limitations and say, hey, this is a serious problem. New York's population is X number and your population is Y number. We can assume and extrapolate the numbers are the same or are, in the same ratio. So it's vitally important that we continue to inform our legislators. We have a window in California right now, and that's open until the end of next year. And we have other states that are beginning to look at New York and look at California and look at Arizona and look at Hawaii and say, hey, we were able to root out abuse, root out cover up, and provide a sense of justice for survivors who've been denied for so long. So New York is a very unique and special case because it has really given us a window into the data and the pervasive nature of child sexual abuse across the state. And no one will be able to sit back and say, oh, it didn't happen here, because now we can say, hey, it's happened everywhere and at these large numbers.
Yeah, so, in the run up to this law passing, we did hear a lot of other ideas about how to structure the Child Victims Act come out. There was talk of, I think, a victims compensation fund. We heard recently about the Adult Survivors Act. Assemblymember Bichotte Hermelin, I was wondering if you could talk about what you have heard in terms of feedback about this law and what other policies might you be interested in pursuing in the future related to this issue.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that. So one of the things that our legislators have been talking about is actually extending the 1-year look back period. So renewing it. We do feel that people still need time. People still need time to come forward. We have a situation where the person that I was speaking of, they have not gotten any response from the controller's office. And they call me every day to call the controller's office. And we have our city institutions that are ignoring these cases. And so that's a problem. I feel that we need to extend the look back period, every year to 1 year and eventually just eliminate the statute of limitations. So, I don't think the statute of limitations should exist. That's just my perspective. We are also supporting the Adult Survivors Act. I am a co-sponsor of it. It extends the exact same opportunity for thousands of more survivors who were sexually abused from 18 years of age and older. And again, it follows the CVA where it will hold the predators accountable in court. So we're hoping that it passed in both houses. It passed in the Senate House. And another thing that we've been struggling with, I'm actually currently in law school right now, and we studied a case under the complicity rule, and I'm sure everybody know about this case. It's the case of Cardinal Bernard Law, and which is a case where Father Guillen, which was under his authority, abused boys in the church. He was transferred. He was sent for treatment. The cardinal knew about the allegations and continued to transfer him. And they settled claims, which is another thing that some of these institutions are doing. And Guillen was viewed as a high risk person. Thought was cured. He would be returned to the parish and continue to abuse these little boys over and over and over. And the question was Bernard Law or even the institution liable for, kind of being an accomplice? And one of the things I did ask my professor, can we hold institutions liable criminally? The answer is no. You can sue them. And I'm happy that the New York CVA allows that. But I think we need to push it a little bit further. So these are some of the things that I'm certainly supporting and pushing.
And what is the appetite of your colleagues that you've heard? There's so many issues on the agenda, obviously, right now.
Oh, they're certainly very supportive. It's a matter of, I guess, where you're geographically situated. I mean, all of this is politics. I have to say the CVA, Child Victim Act, has been something that's been on the agenda to be on the floor for many, many years, over 13 years. And Marjorie Marks, who was the initial sponsor, fought for many years. And the reason why is because we had politics in the halls of our chambers. People were being bought by a lot of these institutions that had claims against them for sexual child abuse. So, you know, it's a new Albany. We want to push this through. We want to pass a lot of these progressive legislation that will help people like me progress in life. So yes, they're for it.
And when the Assemblywoman says you can't hold the corporation responsible for its complicity, I think that you can, and I think it hasn't happened because public officials have been reluctant to prosecute not just powerful individuals for childhood sexual abuse, but the enablers or the institutions such as cardinal law. But in Minnesota, we did turn over the evidence that we uncovered of a cover-up, a massive cover-up, and longstanding patterns and practices for 30 years to the public authorities, as we do everywhere in every state. And in New York, we turned our entire database over to Letitia James and the Attorney General for them to investigate. And I believe they can be prosecuted. I believe the civil suits against individuals can lead to criminal prosecutions. And I think it will lead to corporate prosecutions. And in Minnesota, the Archdiocese criminally prosecuted for child endangerment pertaining to the cover-up of the priests. And there are other cases like that, such as bishops being charged with failure to report. So corporations and the institutions that are complicit in this, Assemblywoman, we couldn't agree with you more. It's time for them to be held accountable. And the laws as they exist can allow it to some extent, but there has to be a will. And the law can open it up further to create a way to impose both civil and criminal liability for the crime itself of sexual abuse and rape, and also for those that are complicit in it.
Thank you. And I just want to invite our audience one more time. Now would be a great time to throw in your questions. If you have any, I could keep going all night, but we definitely want to hear from the audience on this incredibly important topic if you do have any questions for anyone. Okay, so I was hoping, Joelle, maybe could you, or actually Jeff or Joelle, I'd be curious what if you could sort of compare how this is unfolded in New York versus other states. And Jeff, maybe you could speak to how it compares in New York to other states, because I know you file these claims all over the country.
Well, we have been working with survivors and working to open up the windows and across the country and remove the statute of limitations. First time in Minnesota in 1989, and then in California in 2001, and then Delaware. And now with New York and New Jersey and California all having had open windows that we've been talking about, there's also other states that have been inspired. And recently, Maine, Louisiana, and even Arkansas have now amended their statutes of limitations. So there's enormous momentum behind public policy happening as we speak, because lawmakers across this country are realizing that statutes of limitations protect the wrong class of people, offenders and those that choose to protect them, and not the kids and vulnerable adults. And so the Child Victims Act in New York has been one of the most powerful because it was one of the most powerful states and populated states where the lobby against this law has been so powerful and so strong for so long. Judy Rapfogel is on here. She lobbied on behalf of Zero Abuse Project. She knows the Catholic bishops mounted a $10 million lobbying campaign against the Child Victims Act in New York alone. So the lobbies against these reforms, the Catholic bishops aligned with the chambers of commerce, aligned with the insurance industry, aligned with the powerful corporations that don't want to face liability for their accountability, have a powerful lobby that is now being broken down. And New York is a powerful example of how difficult it was and how long it took for it to happen. But now that it has, it is an inspiration to other states and lawmakers across this country.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think that COVID has taught us a lot of lessons, not a lot of lessons that we necessarily wanted to learn, but that we needed to learn. And even events such as this that are recorded and Zoomed and accessible later on are very, very accessible to survivors who may not be ready to go and sit in a meeting and may not be ready to see a presentation, or who fear that they're going to actually break down and cry or be triggered during such a presentation and don't want to be around other people. And so COVID has really taught us many better ways to reach out to survivors where they are at. And because of that, we've been able to really create a critical mass of people who, again, are across the country. And in many states, I think we're going to see big changes in states that had the quote unquote Indian orphanages or boarding schools where children were sexually abused and maybe killed. I think we're going to see big changes in those states because we're building these critical numbers of people who are being empowered because we're able to meet survivors where they're at so much better.
Okay, we've heard a little bit about this tonight, but I was wondering, anyone in the group, I mean, how can protections or benefits be extended to victims of abuse from within the family that the CVA might not be as helpful for, or by other individuals not connected to institutions? What are the sort of top ideas for addressing that in terms of reforming the law to find justice?
Well, Michael, I think you got silence on that, because when we look at family abuse and interfamily abuse, it is so interwoven that the resources available legally, even under this window, available to survivors of abuse within the family, make it a very difficult and sometimes problematic choice. And so we have had success in empowering survivors who have brought suit against fathers, uncles, grandfathers, etc., under the Child Victims Act and settled cases. But we've also had to decline as many, if not more, than we've been able to take. And the reason is bringing a case against a family member oftentimes brings so much secondary effect and disbelief among the other families. They rally around the offender, isolate the family member, and make it even more difficult for them in some ways to recover. So that these cases, when they see success through some of the cases that have been brought in New York by family members, that will inspire people to respond to that and our systems to respond more effectively. But frankly, the law has not given survivors of family abuse much of a chance to date. I'm hopeful, and I think we're all hopeful that it's getting better. And New York statutes limitations law is a step in the right direction, but it's been really, really hard to get resources and validation for survivors of sexual abuse in families. And so we oftentimes aren't able to help, unfortunately, but that doesn't mean we can't, and it doesn't mean we won't.
To add to that, Michael, I was a little hesitant in responding because I just wanted to make sure I understood your question. And if I got your question correctly, your question was about outside of the scope of this narrow arena where there's childhood sexual abuse with theoretically an adult or an institution that has protected that adult, you're talking about within the family when there are those instances. And so I'll speak just about New York. Oftentimes, I think as Jeff was speaking to, oftentimes those cases are going to be heard most likely in family court. And so family court, and in family court, if you were going to be seeking adjudication, you're limited only to what the what the statuses are if you were getting an order of protection, most likely. And so those are incredibly limited, meaning that you have to have sanguinity, which means you have to have a blood relationship with that individual. You have to either be in resident with that person, meaning sharing the domicile with that individual. You have to have a child in common with that individual, and that's biologically, not just adoption. And or you have to be married to that person, and that's a civil marriage and not just a traditional marriage, or so when you just have marriage in common, right? And so that limits the ways in which someone would be able to seek justice outside of the Child Sexual Victims Act, because because then there are, even under those family offenses that are listed there, which have to be expressed, what you don't have are express incidences with respect to childhood sexual abuse, right? They would have to be family offenses that occur, and they would be listed more like an assault or a battery. And oftentimes these incidences would have to be identified as a battery. And then there would have to be, it triggers a whole host of other individuals that are involved, including a child attorney for the child. There'd be an investigation. There might be a removal of that child from the home. There'd be questions around ACS getting involved, which is our Administration for Children's Services here in New York. So it triggers a whole other, for lack of a better word, can of worms that are very distinct, because that child is most likely also a minor in those instances. That wouldn't be an adult that would be able to bring those cases at that point. And so as Jeff suggested, there's a big window in between what I just mentioned as what the current remedies are if something's happening in real time, and what our initial topic is today, which is looking back at instances that have happened in the past. So there's a lot of room for the law to step in. There's a lot of years there where other things could be happening or have happened, where people might need to seek justice, where the law hasn't necessarily stepped in and made any sort of remedies available for folks in those spaces.
Okay, so I just got a question from someone who has a very painful story about actually losing their oldest daughter, who was in state care at the time. So I was wondering, maybe, Jeff, we did talk about this a little bit before the event. I'm curious if any panelists have heard of this. What is it like trying to litigate against the government as opposed to a private institution or an individual? Are there any unique challenges if, you're talking about institutions that care for children, or for example, foster care or juvenile detention?
Well, when it comes to bringing civil actions against governmental units, which can be public schools in some cases, but municipalities, the state and or the federal government for that matter, all of them are given special privileges under the law. Sometimes they're called immunities. That means you can't sue them. In New Jersey, for example, there was sovereign immunity. Any governmental entity was immune from suit in New Jersey until a lobby against that removed it and opened up the statute of limitations in New Jersey, where it is now open. And there are limitations in New York and every state. And so bringing civil actions against governmental entities for their role in allowing sexual abuse has been limited in many ways, because there's caps on damages and special protections where you have to give notice of claims. You can only bring them in certain courts. So to be specific, it poses additional challenges that do exist. It doesn't make it impossible, it makes it more difficult. And in some cases, gives them special protections in public policy that they may not deserve, but are deeply embedded the same way statute of limitations in civil actions used to be in New York.
Okay, Natasha adds in the chat, you often have a limitation of up to 90 days to bring your claim. I got another question. Would RICO or trafficking laws be used against institutions that aid and abet abusers while simultaneously operating as a business?
Well, we brought RICO cases against a Catholic bishop offending, and actually have brought RICO cases across the country in various places at various times pertaining to childhood sexual abuse. They have largely been not received by the courts because the courts have found in those cases in times past that RICO is designed to protect businesses and the infiltration by criminal enterprises into businesses, and sexual abuse damages are not interruption of business. And so for that reason, the RICO cases that we have brought to date have not been successful, but we still believe that there is provisions and opportunities in the state RICO laws in New York and elsewhere that do not mean it can't be done. And that's something we look at right now as we speak. And so we believe that there is a very narrow opening that we're really hoping to be able to use to open it wider that addresses the peril to children and vulnerable adults by enterprises, criminal enterprises that allow it to occur.
Thank you. Okay, Justin, we haven't heard from you in a while. I just want to go back to some of your unique experience talking to victims on the front lines. Could you talk a little bit about a little bit more about how you talk to survivors? Like, you know, what are the things you say, I guess, like the first response?
So in the emergency department, like I mentioned before, we're really dealing with a lot of the acute situations that are happening with survivors. So lots of times when they present to the emergency rooms, it's for different types of injuries that they have incurred. And I take it upon myself that with every patient that I work with, every survivor, I screen them for different types of things that maybe not everyone does. So I screen for trauma history, sexual abuse history, intimate partner violence history, which is definitely encouraged by a multitude of different agencies. And I think that the most important thing to take away from that is to just ask the question. Lots of times I am the first person that's ever asked the person about any type of abuse history. And then, you know, because of the situation, the person feels comfortable to share their story. And sometimes it can really be just as easy as just asking them, like, you know, have you ever experienced any type of abuse by, you know, a family member or by an intimate partner? And that kind of, like, you know, gets the ball rolling on them being able to share their story. And I think, you know, just allowing, you know, them to, you know, have the ability to share the story at a pace that they feel comfortable, I think is also important. And just to know that, you know, making yourself available so that even if the first time that the question is asked, you know, that person knows, okay, I didn't feel comfortable sharing this with, you know, Justin at this point in my, let's say, emergency department visit. But later on, when he comes in to check on me, you know, he provided an environment where I did feel safe to explore that. And then they do feel comfortable enough to share. So I think the biggest takeaway is to just, you know, feel comfortable as the provider, as a clinician, to just feel comfortable yourself asking the questions about these situations, because survivors do want to share. They just maybe don't want to be the person that on their own brings it up, but they will answer questions about it if they are asked those questions.
Okay, thank you. And this is a question I think for the whole group. You know, we've heard a lot about why you should come forward, but, you know, we did also hear, for example, some of the victims of Larry Nassar in that horrible case from Michigan. They did regret coming forward. So I'm just wondering, you know, what are some of the downsides of speaking out if it's not handled appropriately or responded to appropriately?
I'll start. You know, I have never come across a survivor who's regretted coming forward and filing a civil lawsuit. The process isn't necessarily easy or simple. You have to really grow through it. But I think that the challenges that people face in coming forward have to do with the other people in their lives, has to do with family, has to do with, you know, and the regrets or the things that could happen that are bad usually are perceived by the survivor themselves. And I haven't seen, and I've seen people grow through a lot and had to get rid of toxic relationships in their life and the toxic people that are causing these problems. But I tend to, you know, it's such a positive experience throughout. It is difficult, yes, but all things are that are worthwhile. So I really, I think it's important to note that, yes, there will be challenges, but all in all, it always ends up, you know, with so much good possible that it's worth it.
And I think Joelle speaks to this with years of experience working with survivors. I think it also needs to be acknowledged in having worked with survivors for, oh God, 39 years, that it is really, really hard to even deal with sharing this. And as soon as a survivor does, that has suffered for decades, holding this secret, oftentimes mired in addiction and self-blame and grief, anxiety and fear, they are faced with a reality that you're going to have to do something about it. And you're going to have to take control and ownership over your own life in a way you weren't able to before, which means you got to get help and you got to ask for it. You got to get support and seek out support. And you just can't live the way you did. In other words, you have to be willing to change. Control of some of the things that were out of control in your own life, which means deal with the addiction. 80% of the male survivors with whom we work with abused by clergy, as an example, because it's such a betrayal of trust, deal with addiction. And one of the first things we do is say, we're not going to say you got to get treatment. We say you got to get help, and then we got to look at this. And if you're not going to deal with that, we're not going to be able to get you do anything to help you in the recovery of your power and taking your life back. So the reality is, you got to be willing to confront your own demons. Many of them caused by the abuse, but also prevalent and things over which only you as a survivor can do something about. And it's hard, and it's not always successful. In fact, it's often not successful, but if you don't try, you don't give yourself a chance for a better life. And standing up and giving voice to your truth gives you a chance for a better life. And in that there's hope, and in that there's promise, and in that there's always progress by making the effort and starting the action and sharing the secret.
Thank you. We are almost out of time. Assemblymember Bichotte Hermelin, I did want to see if you had anything to add to that or anything else. I know you have to go in a minute. So is there anything else we should be looking forward to in the coming legislative sessions about this, or anything else you want to add on that last question about the downsides?
Yeah, I wanted to just add on to the last question on the downside that one of the biggest fears is you tell the world or you tell someone and no one does anything, nothing. And that's because they don't want to. So I know for me, for a very long time, I had a feeling towards men and feeling towards fathers and feeling towards clergy. Although I'm very religious, clergymen, I felt that I could not trust these individuals and I needed help. I never sought help because if I said anything, I feared that no one would do anything, and I've seen that happen. And so there's that aspect of it as well. You know, you come out, you tell the world, you pursue litigation, and nothing happens. Just like what my friend is going through. The controller's office have not responded. They are ignoring her. So sometimes when you do come out and nothing happens, you ask, was it worth it? Was it worth it? So before I leave, I just want to say, I want to thank each and every one of you for tuning in, for putting this panel together. It was very informative for me. Although I haven't sought any help, this is therapy for me. When I listen to other people's sufferings and how they were able to overcome their sufferings, very, very therapeutic for me. So I thank you, and maybe I'll intern in one of your offices as a law student. But I thank you all for having me tonight.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember, for being here, for sharing that story. I know you've done it before, but it's powerful every time. And I know a lot of people are probably encouraged by hearing you tell your story. And thank you again to all of our panelists for sharing your insight, your wisdom, your expertise on all of this, and your compassion on these issues. As I said at the beginning, they are not easy to discuss, but it's, I certainly believe as a journalist, they are very important to try to shine a light on. So I want to also thank our hosts for organizing this important event. And just remind everyone that deadline, August 13th, is 21 days away from tomorrow. So with that, I will pass it along. And again, thank you everyone for attending tonight.
Good evening, everyone. So thank you all for joining tonight's panel. We hope we provided you with some excellent information and tools to empower survivors to come forward before the deadline to help spread the word. Please feel free to click the links in the chat. I'm just sending them now. And they're to download a poster and receive free stickers that you can plaster around New York to spread the word about the August 13th deadline. And I'm just gonna hand it over to Raul.
Thank you so much for participating in this wonderful panel discussion. Thank you to all the panelists. Sarah, thank you so much for your organizing skills. And unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you again and have a good night.